Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the mayor of the city of Grand Rapids, Rosalynn Bliss. Associate Executive Director and Chief Operating Officer of the Michigan Municipal League, Anthony McGinney. Associate Professor for Michigan State University, Joshua Sapochny. And to moderate the discussion, the publisher and editor of Crane's Detroit Business, Ron Fournier.
So thank you, Ridgway, and thank you for everybody for being here, and thank you, panel. Being relatively new back home to my home state, it has really been striking to me to see the state of our municipalities, a problem long coming. I ran across a stat this weekend that surprised me. 89% of the state's jobs and 88% of the state's GDP comes from metro areas. And these metro areas, as Ridgway said, are in crisis. I see, at least from my reading of this, but I want to get more from the panel, a death trap that the cities are in. It seems to me we start with money being cut and taxes capped, then budgets are busted, then an emergency manager is appointed, and then we repeat the vicious cycle. So I'd like to find out from you guys today, how did we get here? Because I haven't seen anything like this in any other state in the country. And then more importantly, how do we get out of it? So that's kind of the table setting. That's where I would like you to take us. Why don't you guys give us a sense of where you think it is now, and then we'll do some Q&A. And at the end of this, we'll take questions from the crowd, who will come up with much better questions than I possibly could.
Great. Thanks, Ron. I'm going to kick us off as the dispassionate academic analyst of these issues.
Dispassionate, right?
Dispassionate, yeah. And so, we don't have a ton of time, and a lot of the kind of the details I think we can fill in the panel discussion. But so I'm gonna jump right into it here. There's two central points that I want to leave you with, and this is a critically important issue. Hopefully, when you guys walk out of here, you'll recognize, you'll think as sort of passionately and critically about this issue as we do. The first point I want to leave you with is that the notion that Michigan is a strong home rule state is basically absurd on its face. How's that for provocative?
Say it again.
The notion that Michigan is a strong home rule state is absurd on its face. I spent a lot of time thinking about and researching our emergency manager policy. I'm not sure if you guys have ever thought about it, or really thought about it, but there's no greater illustration of how state government, and this is not one particular administration, not one particular legislature, but the state government over the last 40-odd years thinks about local governments in the state. So you appoint an emergency manager with a limited staff. That person runs the city. One person with a limited staff runs the city. All of the extraordinary powers that person is granted are on the expenditure side, meaning the cuts. Right? So you balance through cuts. And there's almost no help on the revenue side, which is one of the things that we're going to sort of delve into today, which is one of the sort of critically important issues. There's no greater illustration of how the state thinks about its local governments than this emergency manager policy. And one of the sort of the punchlines of this is that the state crafted this emergency manager policy out of whole cloth. There's lots of other ways to do it. There's lots of other ways to get involved in local governments that are experiencing financial distress, that aren't as aggressive, that are more, more sensitive to the actual problems that local governments are facing. So the first point is home rule as a concept has sort of lost its meaning to me. This is not just exclusive to Michigan, but as the slide here shows, there's a whole variety of ways that states involve themselves in the financial affairs of local governments. There's a whole variety of ways. Right? States are sovereign. Cities are not in the United States Constitution. Right? They're creatures of the state, which is becoming, I think, more and more true, especially as we see preemptions and the sort of offloading of costs onto local governments taking place across the country. So cities are creatures of the state. States are sovereign. Right? How do the states act on their sovereignty? How do they involve themselves in local affairs? Okay, so the second point I want to leave you with is that there are more or less good, at least from a revenue standpoint, are sensitive or more or less kind of, more or less sensitive to the problems local governments are facing. There are more, there's different ways that states can get involved. Right? So what this figure is showing here is that over time, Michigan has chosen to respond to local fiscal problems basically by ratcheting up its tax and expenditure limits. The two major sources of local revenue are revenue that is intergovernmental revenue from the state, so direct transfers from the state, and local property tax revenue. Tax and expenditure limits are limitations on property tax revenue. So the horizontal axis is showing Michigan becoming much more aggressive in limiting the amount of revenue that local governments can raise. This is their own revenue, right? Limitations on their ability to raise their own revenue. The horizontal axis is revenue sharing or state aid, right? In this state, we call it revenue sharing, but state aid more broadly. Some states have taken the approach of providing more resources to their local governments, providing more aid to their local governments. Almost all states have become more involved. Michigan has chosen what we call a stick approach to local financial affairs, right? Whereas New York is the other sort of case that's highlighted there, has adopted more of a carrot approach. I look forward to the opportunity to talk more about that in the Q&A. But the point I want to leave you with is that this puts cities in Michigan in a really difficult position from a fiscal standpoint. So I'll turn it over to Tony.
Thank you. Just a few points I want to make as we think about this issue. Probably the primary thing that we need to remember about our system here for funding local government in Michigan is it doesn't track with the economy. We have unlimited downward mobility, and we saw that during the recession with dramatic declines in property values, some areas losing up to 50% of their taxable value. But with two constitutional limitations, we are now restrained at what is actually works out to be less than inflation, and we can talk about that in a little bit. Our budget priorities at the state level have been a long and protracted disinvestment in local government. This goes back all the way to the Engler administration, so this isn't something that's new that's happening now, but it's been a very systematic disinvestment that now totals $8.1 billion. And you can look at it on a community by community basis. Those are real services that we are not able to provide to our residents. And that's part of how we generate our value. When you think about what drives the value of a place, what's the revenue generating engine of a community, it's those services they can provide. It helps create value. It helps attract businesses. It helps attract people. And as we disinvest in those things, we're actually damaging the revenue generating capacity of those places and having the opposite impact that we're trying to have, which is to bring them into balance. So we got to start thinking differently about those things. Contrary to what a lot of people think, a lot of the problems that we're facing can't be fixed locally. We need the state to be a partner in this. We need additional tools, resources, legal authority to deal with some of these issues. They're bigger than can be dealt with either on a practical matter or we lack the legal authority to do those. OPEB is a great example of that. We have a huge unfunded OPEB obligation in this state, over $11 billion, but we really lack the effective tools to deal with it.
What's that acronym stand for?
Other post-employment benefits, retiree health care.
Which is what? Thank you.
And so that's a big issue that we need to tackle, but we're not going to be able to do that without state help and state intervention on that. Josh talked about what's going on in some of the other states. In Michigan, we just don't have enough tools in the toolbox because, as he points out, we don't have true home rule. Anything that we want to do in Michigan, we have to be able to point to statutory authority to do that. And absent that, we're not able to do that. So even if everyone in the community wanted to vote to do something, you might not be able to do it if you don't have that statutory authority. We've got to fix that, provide more resources to local government to do things. And we've been advocating around a three-tiered approach to this. Revenue's absolutely a part of that, and we've got some ideas around what we could do to improve that there. But we also need to look at cost, again, cost containment, cost control, and we have to think about the structure of how we deliver services. How do we maximize the investments we've already made in infrastructure and other things to be more cost effective in delivering those services? We have doubled our infrastructure in this state in the last 20 or so years, and we've not added a single person. That math problem doesn't work. You don't have to be a numbers person to realize that that's not going to work. So we got to think differently about that. This graph, I'm going to cut to the chase here. This is total revenues provided to local government for the period from 2002 to 2012. This is census data, not something the league has put together and
cook the books to make it more dramatic than it already is. And as you can see, if you can't read, the writing's a little small, but go all the way to the end, and the only state in the entire country providing less resources during that period is Michigan. And I want you to think about that in the context of your world, where you're trying to be competitive with other businesses. Could you be competitive if your revenue picture looked like Michigan's and all of your competitors looked like the others? The answer is no. So we need to fix that. And lastly, I want to just tie this back to the state budget part. There's not been shared sacrifice at this level. The state, during that same period of time, had more resources, and they starved local government. They disinvested in local government by 56% during that period of time. We've got to think differently. Where do you put the limited resources the state has to get the most bang for the buck? And we think investing them in our local communities is a way to go.
Let's hear from somebody who's living it every day. Mayor Bliss?
That's right, and I agree with him. Put your money in local government. So I just want to give you an example from a city. So I, as mayor of the city of Grand Rapids, I've been mayor for about 1.5 years, but before that I was on the commission for 10 years, and I lived through the economic downturn. And this is a problem that's impacting every single city across our state, including Grand Rapids. And I think sometimes people think that Grand Rapids is, am I pushing the wrong thing? Oh, look at that. And so I want to point out just a couple things, and that is that the city of Grand Rapids, we have wrestled with this as well, and we've been impacted. We've lost, since 2002, roughly $92 million in revenue sharing. And I want to point out a couple things, that in the city of Grand Rapids, there's a lot of amazing things happening. We were able to get through the economic downturn largely because the community came together, the business community, our philanthropic community, but also our residents. And not every city has those types of resources or are able to do that. But we're still in a position where we're struggling in many ways. And here's just, I want to give you if you're not familiar with the city of Grand Rapids, our population continues to grow, which is a wonderful thing. But if you look at the number of employees, so back in 2005, we had roughly 2,000, a little over 2,000 employees, and now we have roughly 1,500. And that is across every single department in our city, including the police department. So 15 years ago, we had over 400 officers. Now we're close to 300. And if you look at our revenue sharing over the years, you can see that it's been in a downward trajectory. And just yesterday, I was in a budget session for about 4.5 hours, and one of the key issues we talked about at length is whether we can afford to hire 12 more police officers and what that will do to our budget this year and 5 years out. And we are extremely concerned that we will have to dip into our budget stabilization fund to fund additional police officers, additional community police officers. And that's in Grand Rapids, where we have a lot of great things happening and we have access to resources. But at the local level, we are still wrestling with these core issues because the revenue piece continues to be a concern. Now, in the city of Grand Rapids, what's happened is there's been a shift from the state to the local units of government. So since 2010, we have passed we increased our income tax for public safety. We passed a dedicated parks millage. We just recently passed a dedicated extension of our income tax, dedicating that to streets and infrastructure. But then at the county level, we have passed, in the last 5 years, we've passed a vets millage. We just recently passed a museum millage and a zoo millage, a senior millage that increased. We have a jail millage. And again, so this is a shift to the local units because people care about their local services and what's available to them, because we know that that's what makes cities great, and that's what attracts families to want to live in cities, and businesses to move to cities. You have to have strong cities, and you have to be able to provide public services, public safety. People want to live in safe neighborhoods. They want to drive on streets where they don't have tires that pop from potholes. They want to be able to walk to a park that is safe, where their kids can play on a playground, where the swimming pool is actually open. And those are things that we grapple with at the local level every single day. And the decisions being made in Lansing impact every single city, including Grand Rapids.
Mayor, do people move to the state for lower taxes or for quality of life?
Quality of life, hands down.
Then how does this conundrum we're talking about affect the quality of life issue?
It absolutely impacts quality of life in our city as well as other cities. I mean, we had years where we had swimming pools in our parks that were closed up. We had wading pools that were shut down because we couldn't afford to open them up. We have, again, pockets of our city where we have significant crime, and all of that impacts quality of life.
What do you say to people who say, though, no, it's the idea that your constituents have voted for these millages and for better parks and zoos and that kind of thing, that's where it should be done. They should just keep raising local taxes. Why can't you keep doing that?
Well, I think it's inequitable. Not every city has those resources or has that ability, and at some point, you are going to get to a place where people can no longer afford to continue to increase their local taxes. Whether their property tax continues to go up, that impacts families every single day, and it impacts the most vulnerable in every single community. Property taxes impact those individuals who are on a fixed income, our seniors, people who are struggling already to make ends meet. In our city, we have a lot of families who are struggling to find affordable housing, and all of that impacts their ability to live and to enjoy their community.
Well, I think, if I could, I mean, and I think that's a symptom of a bigger problem as well, right? When you have to go back and ask for additional millages for all these different things, it's reflective of what is a broken system. Our system isn't working. This limitations on our property tax system we already have, combined with the disinvestment at the state level, has brought about this higher burden that we're asking more and more places to do. And typically, it impacts the places that have the least ability to provide, ask their residents to make those sacrifices.
Give us a quick history lesson. How do we get here to the point where there's a limit on what you can raise and there's less money being shared by the state? Well, and feather in the pension obligations in there as well.
Yeah, so I mean, if you think about it, we have.
Am I correct that a couple of decades ago this wasn't an issue? And this is something that's relatively...
Well, when Proposal A passed, we took away the upward mobility.
What year did that pass?
In the early 90s.
In two sentences, what does Proposal A do?
Proposal A did a lot of different things, but as it relates to local government, it put in place the individual parcel limitations on property values. And so that creates that unlimited downward mobility, and then we're stuck at those lower levels, and we can only move at inflation at 5%. So for most of history...
on what they can raise.
Yes, so for most of history, property taxes only went upward. So that limit didn't come into impact. When you had these huge declines and we're now frozen at those new levels, that means that a city is going to be at that competitive disadvantage forever. It never breaks out of that cycle. And then there's some nuance in the math of some of that when it interacts with Headley. When you sell your properties and you get that pop-up and everyone thinks everybody's benefiting, that actually goes into the calculation for the second reduction, which is the Headley rollbacks, which means it lowers your millage rate, negating that growth period. So we have less than inflationary growth no matter how far we drop. That simply can't work. We will not survive the next recession because of the way that models work. That's
what I was going to ask. What happens when we do have another recession?
It's honestly, for a lot of places, it'll be game over.
Which means what?
Emergency managers in dozens of places.
More emergency managers.
Which doesn't work in and of itself because, again, that process damages the revenue generating capacity of the city. When you take a place that's struggling to provide services and you balance the budget by cutting more services, is that a place you want to locate your business? Is that a place you want to move to? The answer is no.
Josh, is there another state that limits what cities can raise and reduce the revenue share?
Yeah, there's a bunch of states that have adopted tax and expenditure limits over the years. 45, 46 states, I think. But the difference between how Michigan does it and how other states does it, I mean, on the one hand, you have as Tony talked about, you have the layering of these tells on top of one another, right? So the interaction between Headley Amendment and Proposal A.
Does any other state have this kind of confluence of crap?
No other state. So some states have adopted something that looks a lot like Proposal A. Some states have adopted something that looks a lot like the Headley Amendment. No state, to my knowledge, with the exception of California, has adopted something that both of them, right, has layered those two things on top of one another.
But the state spending is much higher there than it is here, correct?
The state spending is much higher, yeah. And I mean, and one of the other key differences with California too is that California's approach to financial distress. I mean, that's really kind of what we're talking about here. Right? Michigan incubates financial distress among its cities. It's not just the cities that you read about in the paper all the time. It's the median city, right, is feeling this squeeze, and then the state's approach to dealing with this distress is the emergency manager policy, which continues cuts And it's the vicious cycle kind of continues. California stays out of the way when it comes to this issue of distress. It has to approve bankruptcy filings, right? But there's nothing that comes close to resembling the emergency manager policy, which is the sort of the state's approach to intervening in distressed cities.
So wave a magic wand. How do we fix the problem we have, and then how do we better address the crisis situations that, no matter what you do, are going to come up?
I'll take a.
Whoever wants to take a shot at it.
I'll take a stab. So more bureaucracy. That's what we need.
Give me a better
answer. Seriously.
Than that, Mayor, can you answer this question? He blew it.
That's fine. No. Wait, hold on. I can be able to explain myself. One of the fundamental problems in Michigan is, and I've lived in other states, and I study all, state-local relations over the last 40, 50 years. And there's this sort of inherent ability in this state to just sort of look backward as opposed to looking laterally. So there's almost no awareness when we interview folks and sort of talk to them about how they approach these issues of how other states, other comparable states, peer states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, New York, New Jersey, these are states that are dealing with the same sort of aftermath of post-industrialism, disinvestment by the federal government. These are lots of cities in need, so there's almost no awareness of sort of what's going on, how these other states take these issues on, right? It's pretty incredible. My argument for sort of creating this awareness is a state agency or department, a cabinet level agency that has a seat at the table when these discussions are being made, right? So there's a lot of agencies and departments at the state level that have a hand in the financial affairs of local governments.
Let me interrupt you. Before we get to another cabinet position, what do we do to fix the funding problem we have here? Having another cabinet.
Cities need a seat at the table.
Right.
The cities need a seat at the table, and when these decisions are being made.
And what would you want that seat to do? Okay, you got somebody in the seat. What do you want him or her to do?
There's a sensitivity to the problems that local governments are facing, right? There's not a lot of expertise in these agencies or departments that are debating this issue, these issues at the state.
So once there's a sensitivity, what is it you would want to do once you build public support? What would you want to have happen?
Yeah, so I mean, I think to Josh's point, let's close that and then I'll go in a different direction for a second. When the last decisions are being made, we're not at the table. I remember this was a decade-old story, but someone in Treasury said, it's like, why, when we all recognize the importance of cities and why we should invest in cities, it never happens. He says, in the waning hours of making those decisions, guess who's not in the room? You guys.
Okay, but I think that changed. I'm going there. I still don't know what you do when you're in the room. Tell me what you do.
I think, number one, we talk about our tax system. Our tax system is broke. It doesn't work. It does not track with the economy. You cannot have a tax system that doesn't track with the economy. We can fix that.
How do you fix it?
Proposal A, the intent of that was to maintain and protect people on a parcel basis. Headley was meant to do it on a community-wide basis. By tweaking both of those, we can maintain the intent of both of those things, maintain those protections, but allow that upward and downward mobility. That can be done in statute. That was not part of what was voted on. That was done during the implementation legislation. We can fix that. That would provide tremendous protection in the next recession. It doesn't change anyone's taxes today, but it provides tremendous
In a couple of sentences, what would allow cities to do that they can't do now?
Your millage rate could roll up and down. So when you have less than inflationary growth, your millage rates can go back, never above your charter limitations.
Give power to the local voters to do what they want.
Exactly. On the Proposal A basis, we would just take those pop-ups and not include them in that calculation. Two minor changes provide tremendous protections. On the revenue sharing side of it, you got to ask yourself, we all recognize we have limited resources. Where do you get the most bang for the buck? You cited a couple statistics about where the GDP is generated, where our activity takes place. It's in our communities. Doesn't it make more sense to invest? If we have stronger, more vibrant communities, can attract...
I'm going to jump ahead and say yes. Okay. Tell me how much more money you need to do this right.
That's an interesting question. I don't know how to answer that question, but I do know that we are...
To bring us on parity, what are we talking about? To bring us on parity with states our size.
We need a system. Forget the dollar amount. What we need is a system that provides the tracking with the economy. We've taken that away. We've stripped that away. There's no relationship. So we have a service demands that don't match up with revenue streams. No one in this room could operate their business that way, but local government's asked to do that every day.
Mayor, as a political reporter, I'll ask you a question. You can answer any one you want.
Okay, good, because I was going to add one thing. But
let
go
me just
ahead.
get this.
All right, let's hear it.
So what do you say to a conservative constituent who hates taxes, probably loves the Tea Party, voted for Donald Trump, and you're saying, you know what, we need more revenue out of Lansing, and I want to be able to raise your millage more. How does this crisis affect that person, and how do you make that person understand this is important to her?
Well, so typically, there are so many things I love about local government, but what I really love about local government is that people deeply care about their community and their neighborhood, and they are willing, and so you can find common ground. And so when I sit down with someone and I say, you know, when you call 911, you want the fire department to show up within hopefully a minute or 2 minutes. When you have an emergency and you call for an officer, you want them to show up.
Okay, but the person says you got enough money.
That costs money.
Cut more waste out of government. I don't trust government. I don't want to give government more money. What do you say to that person?
Well, some people you just can't change their mind. So I also realize that from campaigning, you don't spend a lot of time on the door of the person that will never vote for you.
But I interrupted you. How do you make
this
case to that person?
But I do think you make the case, though. I think it is easy to make the case when you talk about, I can ask somebody, what do you love about your community? What do you love about your neighborhood? And they list off things. And I can talk about, okay, well, your tax dollars go to support that sidewalk that we just replaced, and that street that we just paved, and the tree we planted in front of your house that will actually increase the value of your home. When street sweepers, I get calls all the time from constituents who say, when are the street sweepers coming? Those are tax dollars. We all pay for that. And people, I think when people see where their money is going, they are willing to pay. And that clearly has equated into how people vote in the ballot box for local initiatives.
You know, here's the tricky part. I get that. How do you get your citizens to realize that the problem isn't you or even the initiatives that you have in front of you? The problem is this bigger existential issue that's been going on for 2 decades. How do you get them to care about what we're talking about today and force change on Lansing?
Yeah, it takes a lot of education, and it takes a lot of conversations, and it takes, so a lot of these concepts are complicated, not just to voters, quite frankly, to some new legislators in Lansing, and that's what I want to talk about is term limits, because I think that's a major issue.
Topic.
You know, we can talk about ideas for solutions all day long. I think there are a lot of them. I'm a big believer that you get great people around the table that care about the same thing, and you can come up with solutions to problems.
Does term limits get good people around the table? Or
the problem with term limits is that you don't have time to build those relationships that are absolutely key to solving problems, but also a lot of the people making decisions in Lansing, they don't even have enough time to understand the core issue. And they don't have the history, and they don't understand what brought us to where we are today. And so it's very difficult to be around the table to solve problems when you don't even understand the extent of the problem or where that problem started from. And when you are making decisions based on, you know, the next year or about the next race that you want to run for, because you're looking at 2 years out, 4 years out, 6 years out, you're not making decisions in the long, you're not looking at the long view. I've been around the table in the city of Grand Rapids for 12 years now, and I've had 3 different state reps. And it is unbelievably challenging.
Were any of them voted out, or are they all term limited out?
Term limited out. And so, and we've lost
how soon
really
do they tend to be looking
incredible
to the next
people.
race?
Oh, I have 1 state rep who will be term limited out next year. Her spot's up. So again, that is a major part of the problem. And I was just talking to an individual about part-time legislator, and I said, that's not the issue. The issue is term limits. And I get it's a tough issue to talk about, and the polling isn't there. I don't care about that. We've got to be talking about the negative impact that term limits have had on our state and on local units of government. That's an issue.
Someone who's been commissioning polls and writing about polls for years, people like the folks in this room and the people who you influence can change those polls if you make a case like that. Yeah. This must be a frustrating issue for you, term limits, and how it connects to the issue we're here talking about today. Your job is to try to influence those lawmakers, and you're dealing with a new cast every year.
Yeah, I mean, educating them is a big part of the issue. But, you know, back to some of there's a point made earlier I want to circle back to for a second. You know, we're always challenged, you gotta run government like a business. You gotta do that. But when they say that, what they're really saying is do things cheaper. Because if we ran it like a business, we would invest in our revenue generating capabilities. We would invest in those communities, making them stronger, more vibrant, more capable of doing the things that we want them to do, which is make them vibrant places that attract people, that attract businesses, helps businesses retain and attract talent. And we do the exact opposite. We disinvest in those. No one in this room would be able to afford the registration fee if they ran their business that way. If they disinvested, if the only thing they did was cut, 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 and never invested in their revenue generating capabilities. That's exactly the model we've built for local government. It cannot sustain itself. It's collapsing under its own weight. And if you sort of dig into the numbers of it, you start to realize that. And that's the fundamental thing we've got to change in this system. We've got to make these places sustain. If Flint's going to sustain itself, it's going to be through investment in that community that allows people and business to move back. That's what sustains Flint. There's no amount of revenue sharing and aid and grants that's going to do that. We've got to invest in that capacity. And lest anyone think differently, everybody's playing by the same rules. You might be at a different spot in the continuum, but we've built a system that can't sustain itself. And over time, you can see the difficulties that you have. If you go to Wayne County, I live in Wayne County, I live in the western side of Wayne County. If you look to the east, it's like a time machine. And you can see as communities are in different places on the continuum, their struggles that they're having, because we've built a model that the only way to reward yourself is to build something new. And that doesn't mean anybody moved here, by the way. That means somebody built a new building on the other side of an imaginary line, and we've incented that. We've doubled our infrastructure and haven't added any people. That math problem can't sustain itself. But that's what we incent. That's what we've built. We've got to think differently. Where do we invest the resources we have in a way that's going to be all ships rise? Because that's how we'll really sustain this place and have a more vibrant economy. If you look at the resources we have, we've got great universities, our natural resources are unparalleled, our tax structure is favorable, and we're losing. We've played that into a losing hand somehow. Because what we've done that the other places haven't done is we've disinvested in our communities. The places that are kicking our butt have figured that out, and they're investing in their communities, and they've got a different reality than we do.
You mentioned Wayne County. I live in eastern Wayne County, one of the Grosse Points, which makes me think of another issue, hyper-local government. Do we really need 5 Grosse Points? And do we really need the Grosse Points so disconnected from the rest of Wayne County? And we could, who wants to take that
I'm
one?
not from Wayne County.
I just lost every neighbor. But really, why in the heck are there 5 Grosse Points? I know it goes back 100 years.
No.
No and no.
Yeah.
So why no and no?
Well, yeah. I mean, there's duplication in services. There's a bunch of governments that are doing basically the same things. There's a lot of overlap. And
did it ever make sense?
Did it ever? I think
100 years ago?
You know, in a system that would provide more autonomy to these local governments, that would think about competition and risk taking, and the kind of market environment, I think it could make sense. But unfortunately, that's not what we.
No, it seems to me a legacy thing that made sense 100 years ago that probably doesn't make sense for the next 100 years. But now you have politics and NIMBY all rolled in.
So let me jump in there just for 1 second, real quick. So you've got number one. I bet you everything I have in the world that if you tried to put that to a vote of everyone in Grosse Pointe, every place would fail, right?
Right.
Because they all identified that community matters to them.
Right.
And the second point is, even if we combined it, that's incremental change. And really what we're talking about here is transformational. We've got to have a whole different conversation around this. And whether there's a small bit of efficiency by combining a couple of Grosse Points into something different.
Well, I'm not talking about just Grosse Pointe. This is an issue not all over the state, right? Is this really incremental change, or is that part of real structural change that we need to really
ask yourself
have hard
this question,
conversations
though.
about?
Why does somebody move someplace? Because the answer
Quality
to
of
that
life,
question,
the mayor told me.
Okay, but the answer to that question, they chose that particular Grosse Pointe for a reason. And if we undermine that, again, we damage that revenue generating engine of that place.
You don't agree with him, do you? Is he just protecting his 5 interests? And I'd like to hear the mayor's thought on that.
I think that if you polled the municipal leagues, the 50 municipal leagues in all states, right, you would get a similar sort of story, right? It's more resources and more, less strings attached, right? More freedom to use those resources the way that we want. The difference between Tony and the other 49 in his position is he's telling the truth, right? Is it right? They all can't be the worst states. Michigan, I think, ranks right up there. And to bring it back to my point about more bureaucracy very briefly, It's the, you know, this agency would enable this, you know, a change in thinking. I'm more of an incrementalist than a transformation change guy, and I think that would really, you know, kickstart this incremental change. It's more of a partnership, right? State governments and local governments are partners in governance, in providing these services, core services that aren't going to be provided if they don't provide them. I think that having that sort of discussion, having local governments with a seat at the table is a really important first step.
I want to ask, Mary, real quickly, if we could just give you 30 seconds, if you can just explain the cabinet level thing, because I interrupted you earlier. What is it you would like to
Sure. So
the
governor's office has a sort of an urban affairs office, but it's in the executive office, so it turns over. I'm saying cabinet level that exists across you know, legislative terms, that exists across governorships, right? That's there, that's permanent, that you know, for which there's resources, there's staff, there's expertise that's being built around these issues, so yeah, that's what I would like to see. And Pennsylvania has something like this, New Jersey has something like this, and I think it really makes a huge difference in the way that local fiscal problems, but just local affairs more generally, what local governments do, what they provide, their role. It changes the way that those issues are thought about. Here, right, we run the emergency manager policy out of Treasury. Well, it's pretty obvious how the problem's going to be defined, right? It's an accounting issue. So we just balance the budget, right? Lop off the top.
Thanks, Josh. Mayor?
So I want to add a couple points. The point about businesses. I think businesses in our community are amazing partners, and we've actually learned a lot from businesses.
Like what?
Do cities operate like businesses? No. You know, you're not looking at the bottom line. You're looking at quality of life, public service, public safety. But we've learned a lot from our partners. I mean, we implemented lean. We learned that from a number of manufacturers. We have teams that came in and looked at what we're doing and our systems and our processes and helped us really rethink those to be more efficient. And we still embed that in everything we do. We do A3s for a lot of our services. And we do collaborate with a lot of our partners, both the county and other cities around us. And we are very open to looking at how do we collaborate, share resources to do what's good for the community. But it's more complicated than that. I've sat around a lot of tables where we're trying to figure out a way to partner more and even look at, can we come together around parks, and can we have a regional park system? But every local unit, you have different revenue streams, and you have dedicated taxes, and you have constituencies who feel very, very deeply and passionately about this park in their neighborhood, and so it sounds way more simple than it is. I've actively had conversations about how do we get there, and it takes a lot of listening, and it's more complex. But we collaborate a lot. But that too, even though we work with businesses, we've learned a lot. We've done a lot of lean work internally. We partner as much as we can. There are just some things that cost money, and a big one is infrastructure. During the economic downturn, the first place we cut funding to capital. Right? You don't have money to pay your mortgage, you can't fix your roof. And so that's what we did. So we have all this aging infrastructure that now costs more because we weren't able to do asset management 10 years ago. So we're paying more for the streets and the sidewalks and the sewers and the water system. And so you know, there are elements of the services that we provide at the local level, and that price tag isn't going away. And a lot of it is around not just providing public safety, which is our largest line item, is police and fire in our general fund, but capital. And we need infrastructure for not just to be a great city, but for every single business. When you're trying to attract them to a city, you need good infrastructure.
Mayor, I want you to think, well, I asked Tony a question. I want you to think about, with the last couple of minutes we have, you'll have about 30 seconds at the end to do a direct call to action to this audience. So what is it you need them to do for you? Tony, my line of sight here is Congressman Kildee. Can you draw a direct line from this issue to what the tragedy that happened in his city?
Absolutely. You had 100,000 people trying to sustain a community that was built for 200,000 people. Math doesn't work. And that's what we've built. We've enabled people to walk away from cost. When someone moves out of community, all the legacy costs are left behind. Does that make Flint?
Connected to Flint.
Well, I'm saying these are issues that were connected to Flint. And You're asking 100,000, half the people to maintain that infrastructure that was built. Again, that doesn't work. We've created a policy where we incent creating new infrastructure. I said a few minutes ago, we've doubled our built infrastructure in our state and not added people to sustain it. That doesn't work. I mean, all of those things, when you layer them on top of each other, combined with our broken property tax system and disinvestment from revenue sharing at the state level, Flint lost more revenue sharing than their deficit ever was. Just
How did that lead to kids getting poisoned in Flint?
Well, back to what the mayor said, if you can't afford to invest in your infrastructure, maintain your infrastructure, you're forced to make tough decisions. When an emergency manager has one job and one job only, balance the budget. So they tend to be a little more constrained in their view of what they might consider making decisions. If that's made by the community as a whole, you look at a variety of factors. A lot of people say, well, you know, Detroit's water rates were going up exponentially. Let's just say I'll stipulate to that fact. They have hundreds of customers, only one of them made that decision. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, because there's a lot of other factors that go into that. So,
because of where they were in that vicious cycle.
Exactly.
And the addition of the emergency manager displaced local government, right? So the outlet for voices when the water tasted bad, smelled bad, right, initially, before it became a crisis, when it was just a problem, that outlet disappeared with the addition of the emergency manager. Right? So there's emails going to all levels of government because there's utter confusion about who's in charge. And I think the emergency manager really sort of plays into that, really interacts with that in a way that's not useful for the responsiveness of local governments to the problems that they face in their communities.
So, Mayor, you got the clock ticking in front of you.
Oh,
you got the rest of that time. Then we're going to take some questions from the audience. Very influential group of people. What is it you need them to do when they get off this island?
Well, for all of you know elected officials in Lansing, I would say encourage them to, when they're making decisions, to think about the impact on local units of government and cities instead of having us be an afterthought. And then secondly, talk about the damage of term limits. Start having that conversation. And I think it's one of the core issues in our state.
Thank you very much, Mayor. Thank you to the whole panel. Can we have some questions now, please? And the mayor gave you guys back 15 seconds. You can use them while you're at. Any questions?
So is this a question of overall revenue or allocation? How does Michigan compare in terms of its total revenue as a percentage of state GDP to other comparable states, one? And two, is this more about allocation and the way that the structure of what we do, or are you talking about needing more revenues, period?
So I'm not sure in terms of the relationship with total budget, but I'll speak to the second part of that question. This isn't about we want to raise everybody's taxes tomorrow. It is about where we allocate the resources that we have. We have built into statute today, a lot of people don't know this, an assigned amount that is supposed to come out of the sales tax and flow to local government for revenue sharing. And there's one little caveat. It says subject to appropriation. So there's been a strategic decision every year at the state level to not make that prescribed investment in our communities and divert those monies to the state level, to fund the bureaucracy at the state level. And a lot of those investments have been in the balance sheet of the state, which has helped the state and their credit rating. But again, it's disinvested in the revenue generating capacity of our communities, their ability to provide those services. The second part, again, would be correcting some things that I don't think were really understood or certainly not intended by the voters in our tax system. A tax system has got to be able to track with the economy, and we've built it in such a way that it can't. You cannot have uncontrolled downward mobility and horribly constrained, less than inflationary constraints on the upward side. That simply cannot sustain itself. And I truly feel another recession will be devastating to our state.
Let me push back on your statement that this would not mean, we're not talking about increasing taxes. State leaders would tell you there's been a lot more pressures on their budget since the recession. And if more money is appropriated to cities, it's got to come from somewhere else. And they're not going to want to cut other things, that there may have to be tax increases. How can you say that this can be fixed without tax increases? Well,
let me put it this way. I would go back to the graph that I showed a little bit ago. The states saw increases in their general revenue streams, and that was not shared equally. The cities bore a larger burden than the rest of the state did, and that's not a fair equation. So if ultimately it means more taxes because they want to do additional things, that's fine, but that is a discretionary budget decision. And so whether or not we need to overall raise tax or not, I don't know, but there's an opportunity within the structure we have to do better by our communities.
Gotcha, thank you. More questions? Yes, ma'am.
Leslie Murphy, what do we do about the post-retirement obligations that are
Thank you
weighing
for asking
every unit of government down?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge issue. And I'm sorry if I jump in, but I've been working
okay.
on that for months. That's going to absolutely require the state to be a partner in that. There's no way that gets fixed at the local level. It's a big and complicated problem. But I think there's some common sense things we could do along those lines. Chief among them, we have a very antiquated way of delivering those benefits. We're providing 2017 health care. In a lot of cases, you have plan designs that date back to the 80s. Modernize those designs. That would have a dramatic, I mean, everyone here manages those costs, and you have the ability to do that. We don't. Let's fix that. So we're having a plan design that matches the benefit levels. Let's look at cutting it off to new hires. There's a lot of practical things we could do that would not strip retirees of their health care, that would have an opportunity to reduce those costs. And that would be like getting additional revenues. If we can shrink down the annual cost, that's an opportunity for us to provide additional services. There's a huge diversion of current resources away from services to provide legacy costs.
Thank you, Tony. Mayor, can you talk about how that's affecting you at your level?
Yeah, so, and Tony should probably talk about, you were just on that task force. I don't know if you want to. So in the city of Grand Rapids, we did just what Tony said. Several years ago, through bargaining, we closed our defined benefit retiree healthcare system, and we moved to an HRSA. So
Again,
we have
acronym
two
means?
retiree healthcare savings account. So which is much more predictable, right? So you know we put in a certain amount of money into an HRSA for employees for them to have funds available in the future when they need retiree healthcare. So we have two systems. We have the closed system, which has significant unfunded liabilities, even though we put significant amount of money in there every year. The problem with the closed system is that the costs escalate and are escalating so quickly, it's really difficult to meet the escalation of the cost for the closed system. And that's the unfunded liability piece. So last year, the legislature talked about some solutions for future liabilities. A lot of cities have done exactly what we have done. They've already closed the system. Where we need a solution is for the closed system where you have unfunded liabilities, because there is a solution moving forward that many cities, us included, have already fixed.
Thank you for asking that. I should have. More smart questions out there? Congressman.
Thank you. A comment. First of all, I think on this issue of allocation of revenue, we have to think differently about it. We have to think more long term. And this notion that it's a zero-sum game is a complete falsehood. The only way we get to balance, whether it's the federal budget or the state budget, the only way we balance budgets and local governments is through growth. And the way we grow is investing in places and investing in people. So the question really is, if we were to invest in these communities, for example, if the federal government were to engage in a massive expenditure on infrastructure, I have a concern that absent some really thoughtful approaches, that all that will do is fuel more unsustainable patterns of development, just the way the same investment in the last generation fueled some of that unsustainable development. I wonder if you could comment on how you would target significant infrastructure investments so that these sorts of communities that are struggling, which covers the whole spectrum, would not be left behind as a result of cash stimulating unsustainable patterns of development.
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question. And I think when you look at what we've incented to do, it's not just the infrastructure itself, but we've encouraged our tax systems built in a way to encourage you to continue to expand. We expand the infrastructure. We actually will, even when we have excess sewer capacity, the state will get a grant to build new sewer capacity rather than use what we have. I mean, those are things that just don't make sense. It wouldn't make sense to anyone in this room that had excess manufacturing capacity. They wouldn't build new capacity. They'd maximize the usage of that. We don't have the ability to sort of constrain that. You're going to get what you incent. So if we incent to use the infrastructure that we have to help sustain some of that stuff, I think that's the outcome that we'll get. Under the current incentive system, we continue to build a model that's unsustainable. So I think we've got to just rethink and incent the outcomes that we want.
Right. Congressman Kildee, is there anything Congress could do to help restore authority back to local governments and help them solve their problems? Would you mind giving back the mic? Where has Congress let us down here? How have you screwed up,
You got
sir?
7 minutes.
It's a long list. I think, first of all, just as we really don't have a seat at the table at the state government, there really is no seat at the table at the federal government either. I sit on the Financial Services Committee. I got on that committee because it's supposed to be the place where the urban agenda is discussed, and it never comes up.
Really?
So we would start by actually putting the UD back in HUD and actually having urban development as a part of the national agenda. But I think specifically where we can do better, and this is why I raised this issue of infrastructure, because what I'm working on is essentially a Marshall Plan for cities that we would put in the $1 trillion or $1.5 trillion infrastructure investment that's getting a lot of attention right now. I think that would be a start. But you know, obviously there's a lot more that we should be doing. The president's budget, for example, essentially eliminates what modest support is remaining for cities now through the Community Development Block Grant or the home funds that are supporting affordable housing. Those under President Trump's proposed budget are funded at exactly zero.
Now, the president did make infrastructure a part of his campaign, which is unusual for a Republican. Do you sense any hope that the White House might work with Democrats on this issue? And Democrats might work with the White House on this issue?
Well, we had some hope. I think the concern we have right now is that the overarching issues of some of the challenges that the president's facing that don't really have much to do with policy, and the failure of health care reform, and the failure, and I'm not for that, by the way, and the failure to effectively deal with taxes is going to make it increasingly difficult to do anything big on infrastructure. But if he does pivot to that, I think it's the one place where you're going to find Democrats willing to work. My point is, if we're going to deliver the votes, we have to have our priorities included in whatever is put together.
Gotcha. Thank you, sir.
I'm sorry.
Mayor, did you want to add something while we go to the question?
Yeah, I just wanted to add about infrastructure. We need to fix what we have before we build new. I think we need to require asset management, and you actually follow and do and follow your asset management plan. I think those two are really key pieces with infrastructure, and thinking more broadly about infrastructure to include technology and broadband.
Just quickly, to the Congressman's point, I mean, you know, one of the ways I got into sort of thinking about the role of state governments and local affairs is because I started out thinking about a federal urban policy and doing some research on that. And you've seen a steady disinvestment at the federal level in cities, and place-based targeted resources to cities, direct transfers to cities, and specifically cities in need, right? Some need-based formula. That's one of the reasons why state governments are so important now as a sort of an area of focus, because they've taken over this role. And some of the states are doing better than others.
Yeah.
I see a question back there. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Bill Wild, the mayor of the city of Westland, and
How you doing, sir?
Bliss.
Hi, Mayor.
Nice job. Keep up the good work. In the league, thank you for pushing forward on this important issue, and thank the Mott Foundation for sponsoring this important conversation.
Definitely.
This really, truly is one of the issues that's affecting the state. I'm glad there's a program here today on it, but this is strong enough to maybe be one of the pillars of next year's conference. And what we really needed, and I think Tony did a good job of kind of laying out some of the potential solutions, what we really need is leadership at the top making this a priority for the state. We got a governor's election coming up. I haven't heard a governor's candidate on either side of the partisanship make this a priority. This should be one of the top priorities for the state of Michigan. So I just encourage everybody to talk with your state legislators. When you're talking to these potential governor candidates, saving Michigan cities has to be a priority because it's such an important thing for the future of the state. As Ron said, 80% of the state's GDP is created in our metros. So we need to invest in our state. If we want to be a top 10 state like the business leaders of Michigan are pushing for, you've got to invest in your cities. That's where people live. That's where businesses invest. Thank you.
I think it's an interesting idea, making it a pillar. If 200 people walked up to Sandy today and said, hey, make this a pillar next year, it might happen. Start with that. Any other questions? Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thanks.
Yes, sir.
John Molzino with the Mackinac Center. Ron, you asked the question, do people move for tax rates or quality of life? And I'd say when I've moved, it's been for a job. And during the period of time that we've been talking about the problems with municipal finance, Michigan's job growth has been significantly above the national average. The wage growth has been above the national average. And even in Grand Rapids, it's one of the best cities in the Midwest for attracting new residents from outside the state.
Do you live to work or work to live?
Both.
But you want the place you work and where you're raising your family, you want it to be in decent shape too. It's not just about having the job, but what you do when you're not working, right?
Well, yeah, but I live in soon to be your former hometown of Grosse Pointe.
Very good, very good.
But the point is that something somewhere is working with the way we've structured the state. So are we concerned at all that the idea of reworking how municipal finance works, making, I mean, effectively the idea of playing with Headley and Prop A to allow non-voter approved tax increases to happen, that's going to put a brake on the economic growth that the state has seen in recent years?
So I would challenge that, because what we haven't had is true growth in this state. We've added a few jobs here or there. If you compare us on a relative base across the country, we're losing ground. And all you have to do to validate that is what's happening to our congressional delegation. It continues to shrink, which means on a relative basis, Michigan is not being competitive. And we like to anchor ourselves to the fact that we added a couple jobs here or there, and we declare victory on that, when in reality, we're losing ground. And you can look at the areas that are kicking our butts because they're experiencing true growth, and they're having all those same jobs and everything else, but they're having people, and that's what's sustaining our economy. We won't win, we won't be competitive until we are attracting people back to Michigan, and we're not going to be able to do that until we have strong, vibrant communities. If we don't invest and don't have those places, we cannot and will not have a strong economy.
Do you want to take us home, or you were clearing your throat to say something? Or?
Well, and I was just going to add, I mean, I think about Grand Rapids, and I will say, Grand Rapids is an amazing place. Of course, I'm biased. But we are where we are today because the community has stepped up again and again, including the business community and the philanthropic community and taxpayers. Taxpayers have gone back and voted to pay more because they want Grand Rapids to be a great place. That is not true for every city and in this state or even throughout the country. And so we're very fortunate, but that may not be the case someday. We may get to a point where we don't have those dollars to invest, and we don't have the public infrastructure and the public funding to support that. And we're able to leverage public dollars with private dollars really well in our city, and I'm grateful for that. That's the story today. That may not be the story in the future. And so relying on people to continue to dig deeper to support their local community because they're not getting the resources they need from the state or the federal government is short-sighted, in my opinion.
Okay, a couple things. First of all, if anybody knows of a place in Detroit, my wife and I are looking for one. Second, thank you all for coming out. This was a great conversation. Thank you, Ridgway White, for sponsoring it. Thank you guys for your smart stuff. Have a good day.